kind of weird to be standing with like my back to half of you, so I apologize. If you can't hear me very well, let me know. Maybe we'll put the computer over there. My name is Rebecca Bean. I currently work for BYU as one of the heads of the UX team. I am UX certified with the Nielsen Norman Group. They're some of the leading experts in UX or user experience. I'll have my master's certification next year, so I'm very excited about that. I started out initially as a graphic designer and then came to BYU and started doing more web development and then eventually to UX. So kind of like dabbling in all areas, but I love it all. I've been doing Drupal for about 3 years. BYU's been kind of moving away from Drupal lately, and so it's kind of sad to like not have a lot of experience anymore, and it's not really in my job description anymore either. But I still love it and try to do it on the side. So we're going to talk a little bit about the UX process, and this is a graphic that comes from Nielsen Norman Group about how you should build your website. You start with your content, figure out the priority and structure, figure out how the user is going to interact with it, and then move on to your visual design. Especially if you're a designer that's not used to working for web, you do a lot in print, it's really tempting to start with a visual design and go from there, but usually creates a very poor user experience for a pretty website. Okay, so this is the basic UX process that we use here, that we use at BYU, but it's generally something like this just about anywhere you go. You start with your research, and you move on to analyzing what that data has told you, and then design for a good user experience, add the user interface onto that, develop the site, and then validate that the site's working like you intended for it to do. So there's a lot of things that I'm going to dabble on UX. Each one of these could be like a day-long topic on its own. So there will be time for questions at the end, but I'm hoping to touch more on things that you'll come across in developing a website, and just touch on these things like personas that are good user experience methods, but not necessarily something that you might not come across in your daily jobs. So with personas, what a persona is basically a person that you created that embodies a group of your users. So for example, you'll see persona cards like this a lot. It'll have a picture of a person, and that you can even base it off of a person that you know, but it generally is supposed to envelop what part of your user base, your customer base is like. And so you build a person, you say, here's their age, their demographics, their goals of what they want to achieve from this particular app or website, things that they're normally frustrated by in this atmosphere, and then a bio or an about me where it's just general information about this person. Because one of the things that you don't want to forget when you're creating a website is that your users have a life outside of using your website. And so this kind of helps remind you that this is a real person, not just a generalized person. So at BYU and in other universities, you're going to have pretty standard persona set where you've got faculty, full-time employees, students, alumni. So we have a general persona set that we use at BYU a lot, but we do come across some projects where it goes out a little more in depth. Jobs to be done is a new thing that's kind of come on in the last few years that some people would say that it's better than personas, but actually it is something that works well in tandem with personas. A job to be done, I'm going to show you guys a quote really quick by Henry Ford. If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So when you're trying to build a product, sometimes having those personas will help you see what it is that you need to do and what you need to build. But sometimes those personas don't really know what they want. They have a job to be done. The job in this case is that they want to get from point A to point B as fast as possible. How they get there is not really something that they're super concerned with. So Henry Ford goes out and he builds a car instead of just providing a faster version of the horses that they were using at the time. You can do the same thing with websites. Sometimes they just have a job that they want to get done, but sometimes it's more based on who they are and what they do. So you kind of have to work on which one of those works best for your situation. So one of our first steps is gathering data. You need to know who your users are, so you can do that with personas and whatnot, but sometimes you need to do that by doing some surveys and other things to find out who's using your product or your website, whatever the case may be. You can also do an in-person survey. We actually do this a lot at BYU. We find out we get a lot better reciprocation. And I think part of that is because students have a tendency to send out surveys for their class projects all the time. People are really tired of doing online surveys at BYU. And so when we go and do things in person, we bribe them with candy, and we usually get about 50 surveys filled out in an hour. You can also do moderated testing. That's also kind of, it's not a survey, but it is in person, meaning that you are there watching, trying not to influence their outcome, but just guide them on what tasks they're supposed to do and then watching how they do it. And you can also have unmoderated testing and analytics software that watches where they look on the screen, where their mouse moves, and other things like that, what they're clicking on, what sites are visited the most. This is it's a quote essentially from a Nielsen-Norman group called the observer expectancy effect, meaning that if you ever state what your beliefs or expectations are in an experiment, the person will usually feel like that's the right answer, that's what I need to say. Sometimes you do get people that we call professional survey takers, meaning that they're really good at seeking out surveys, especially ones for money, and then answering what they think you want to hear or just answering as fast as possible. So if you can try to weed those people out and then try to make sure that your expectations are not obvious so that that person can't bias their own opinions toward what they think that you want to hear. I'm not going to go super into depth of this. I am going to share these slides on the Drupal Utah Slack after this. So I've got a lot of links in here that I highly recommend you guys check out, but we're not going to go super into depth just for the lack of time. But this is the Qualtrics 10 tips for building effective surveys. And it just basically goes through some things that you should do. I get surveys all the time where I just think either that's a really bad question or you'll get absolutely no usable data out of that question. And so why ask? So a few things that I might want to make a note about that is that Nielsen-Norman group talks about the limitations of response scales. That's when you get like a Likert scale where it's like on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you enjoy doing this? And so these are some of the limitations. Self-reported data can be very unreliable. Some of us are very not self-aware, and that's sometimes very much me. And then they measure subjective user perception, not objective performance. So once again, how you perceive that you're doing on something rather than how it's actually happening. For example, I was doing a moderated test of our mobile app for BYU one time, and it was for a parking feature, and I went up and I was actually working with somebody at the IT building. You would think they're a little more technical, usually faster with computers, and this guy was just struggling so hard to do a basic task. And so, I mean, we're talking like 15 minutes, or sorry, 15 seconds plus for just a simple click. Couldn't find what he was looking for. And when I asked him afterward, did you have anything that you found difficult or frustrating? And he was like, nope, everything was great. And I think that's one of those things where moderated tests come in very handy, because sometimes whether they're embarrassed to say that they struggled with it, or they just completely unaware that it took them that long, or that long was not normal compared to everybody else that you've tested, their user perception might have said, oh yeah, that was a 10, totally fine. But when you were watching them, it was more like a 3. They also don't pinpoint any weaknesses or strengths of the experience. You just simply ask on a scale, what is it? But you can't say why. And then small sample sizes provide statistically insignificant data. If you're doing 5 people or less, for example, absolutely no significant data there. Usually you can get about 10 to 20 people will start giving you some significant data, because you'll start seeing a lot of repeat answers. But if you can get 50 plus, that's fantastic. It really just depends on your project. Maybe your user base is so small that you don't have 50 people if you surveyed every single one of them. So just try to get as many as you can until you start seeing such a big trend that it's kind of hard to ignore. Especially here at BYU, we believe in open-ended questions. And the reason for that is when I take surveys, I often am not sure if I'm going to get a chance to have that, do you have any other comments box at the end? And so sometimes I'll put my comments that I have in earlier questions because I just want to make sure it gets said and I don't know where else to put it. And open-ended questions often give you insight to the users that you otherwise would not know. For example, we asked while doing surveys for the mobile app, what are features that you would like to see, and found out that there were several people that wanted to know how to access the testing center through the app so that they could see their grades really fast instead of having to wait for it to come up on a TV screen or wait until they got home and could go on a computer. And so those open-ended questions enabled us to find out features that we were missing, and we implemented that testing center app, and now there's millions of hits every year. So you could be missing something big, and just because you're not asking an open-ended question, never find out what that is. Also, take your survey for a test drive with your coworkers before you send it out. Make sure that they don't see anything out of the usual. When you work on your own projects, I'm sure you guys know, you just kind of become blind to it. You're just so done looking at it that you don't necessarily see things, even typos, that would be really obvious to another person. So we're going to test drive some things. This is from Bad Survey Questions on Twitter, and I love it because it's just people posting the worst survey questions that they find online, and you get to go and judge them. Let's get some audience participation here. I've got these tickets that I can bribe you with. And so somebody tell me, what is wrong with this question?
Usually your surveys are organized with some sort of order. This has in the middle of choice at the very top.
Right.
It's not graded.
And then poor and very poor are
Yeah.
And if I had to guess, they probably didn't put it in this order. They probably put it in the correct order and then allowed Google Forms or whatever to rearrange the answers so that they didn't get like first answer every time thing. That's probably what happened here, but just keep an eye out for that. Okay, how about this one? How important is rugby union to you? I mean, by raise of hand, who in here isn't interested in rugby union at all? Few of us at least. And so there's no option to say I'm not interested at all. Like, you know, somewhat interested doesn't even fit my category. And then, you know, just styling for that next button is horrific. All right, how would you rate Velveeta in terms of being tasty? Who has there's a couple things wrong with this one.
It's skewing because you're promoting that it's tasty already.
Okay, so there's actually two more. That was a good one. Does anybody ever rate very tasty by, or being tasty by very high? And my biggest problem here is the moderate and average. What's the difference? What's the difference between moderate and average? I wouldn't know if I wanted to be in the middle which one to pick. All right, dietary wishes: none, vegetarian, vegan, gluten-free, strongly disagree, or other. You guys all laughed, so I'm pretty sure there's nobody in here that doesn't get that one. If so, come talk to me after. There's like 3 or 4 things wrong with this one. This is our last one here. I don't care about sports. I don't understand how some people are so obsessed. Correct. There's 2 different things there. That's what we call a loaded barrel or a double question, where you're asking 2 things at once. They may agree with one and disagree with the other, and they can't differentiate in the answers which one is which. Anybody else see anything?
Either agree or disagree is outside of the normal range of questioning. So
Right.
Nobody would expect that to be one of the answers.
And styled like a next button. There's one more, and this is actually something I missed, but somebody else caught last time I did a presentation like this.
I think it's a little confusing. They say definitely on both ends of the spectrum. You weren't clear if you said disagree or agree.
And then like,
Because definitely it sounds positive.
yeah.
This was strong. Maybe.
And going along with that, definitely disagree is red, which generally denotes that this is a bad thing, and green being good. And so if you have that color differentiation, it's usually telling the person that this is the bad answer, even though it's nothing inherently bad with disagreeing with that statement. Also, accessibility issues, we'll get into that later. There's another survey meme that I absolutely love. I didn't put it in here, but it's Windows 10 asking people like, would you recommend Windows 10 to a friend? And they're like, I need you to know that people don't go around recommending operating systems to their friends. Yeah, sometimes there's just questions that you're like, does the average person care? And if you're asking the average person, maybe that's something to take into consideration. Okay, so now you're getting some data. Now you might do surveys several times. You might do it to find out who your demographic is. You might do some open-ended questions at that point to find out things that they're interested in, what some of the questions you need to be asking, and then do another that's more quantitative so that you can get some hard data based off of the questions the open-ended questions that you've had before. When you are surveying several people, like 50 plus, open-ended questions are kind of tough to go through because it's just, that's hard staring at the data and trying to compile some similarities between answers. Whereas if you're asking like a multiple choice question, it's a little more easy to just have Qualtrics or Google Forms or something to say 50% of the people said this. All right, so now you're going to analyze that data. When you're compiling the data, I have a few tips. State the goal of the survey. What were you hoping to achieve by asking these questions? Not saying that you have a hypothesis of how it was going to turn out, even though you could state that, but just that you had a purpose in doing the survey at all. Note how the survey was administered. For example, at BYU, we go to the Wilkinson Center, which is the main student hub where the food court is. So there's a good chance of catching, especially if we're looking for freshmen, a lot of people that are just coming through that building for various reasons. And we also try to make sure that we're asking demographic questions so that we know a lot of times when we're asking about technical apps that we don't necessarily want a ton of answers from the CS majors because they have a very different perspective on how technology should be done. And so we know how like we were in this part of the Wilkinson at this time of the day because where you do your survey and when could definitely skew the type of people that you're getting answers from. And then share your demographic information, you know, in our case, are they freshmen, junior, senior, faculty, sophomores, let's not leave them out. And then any age information. Sometimes it's really useful to know, do you use an Android or an iOS device? Because things are very different sometimes depending on what the app, how it's made. And then share the statistics for the survey responses with summaries of the findings so that people don't have to necessarily read all of the statistical data on those charts. Instead, you can say, here's all the statistical data, but too long, didn't read. This was the finding that we got from the statistical data. All right, now we're moving on to the user experience design. So this is a little bit more about implementing your research, figuring out what your content is, structuring your architecture before you make it look pretty. So we're going to strengthen your site content first. Strip out anything that's unnecessary content that don't support user tasks because there's a lot of things that we have, a lot of fluff. Sometimes that comes from our stakeholders, like from coming up from the top down. That's what I wanted to say. Where they want quotes and they want pictures and everything. And sometimes those things are important. Sometimes they help a visual balance. But more often than not, there's just so much that like it just ends up getting cluttered. On the average web page, users have time to read at most blank % of the words during an average visit, but blank % is more likely. This is from Jacob Nielsen, the person that coined the term UX. Does anybody have any guesses what the percentages are?
I'll guess like 30 and 50.
Okay, we're getting a few answers. So I hear like 50 and 30 and 25. So the first one, 28% of the words during an average visit. How much is more likely? 20%. A fifth of your page is actually being looked at, like or read anyway. So when you're doing that, it's kind of like this object lesson by raise of hands. Who's had this before? Does anybody recognize this? Quite a few of you. So I see this at church all the time, especially. They tell you, put in the important things first. Put in those big rocks into the jar, and then the smaller pebbles, and then the sand, and everything fits. Make sure you get your important priority things first. But if you do it the other way around, you put in the little things. Then you put in the pebbles, and then the rocks. The most important things won't fit. And that affects your website as well. You want to make sure your important information is the most prominent and the first thing that they see. And then they can look for details under accordions or farther down on the page, through links, etc. So this is what we call the F pattern of reading. This is a screenshot from Nielsen Norman Group. This is where they've used some eye tracking software and had a person look at a screen and the software watches where their eyes go on the page. And so you'll notice that they're touching a little bit on this title there, and then a ton on the first paragraph, and then they just start skipping down the left side of the page. It's really great to have what we call microcopy, where you have little subheaders and other summary text that sticks in front of your paragraph so that when they're looking, they can easily find very quickly what they're looking for. Notice, however, almost nothing touching the right side. That's because when we look at websites, quite often the right sidebar is used for ad space. And especially if you have pieces of content that look like ads, they're going to treat them as such and absolutely ignore them entirely. I think there's like a little bit of a blue dot halfway down. And that's because it kind of looks like a link instead of an ad. So just be aware when you're designing things, especially if it's pictorial, try to keep it off of the right sidebar because it'll just be ignored. Structuring your info architecture. We're gonna watch a cute little video really quick. Hopefully you guys can hear it because it's coming from the sound on the projector and I know it's not super loud. So this is going to be a video about card sorting, which is a method that we use to do kind of a user survey on, you have all of the content that's important to your site, now you wanna know how to organize it. So we're gonna watch this really quick.
Meet John. He is looking for a piece of information on your website, but is struggling to find it. Like John, there may be many others just as frustrated. This could reduce the number of visitors and miss out on potential revenue. Who wants to use a website that is frustrating, right? Not John. So how do you help your users find what they're looking for? Well, start by testing with the simple process of card sorting. Card sorting is a powerful technique used by experts all over the world to find out how other people would group and label content on your site. Understanding these patterns helps you organize information in a way that makes sense to the people using your products. You can create a card sort in 3 simple steps. First, you need to define the cards. You can label the cards with information from your site. Then, get some people to sort the cards into groups that make sense to them. Once the results are in, you can identify any patterns found using visual statistical tools like similarity matrices and dendrograms to understand and analyze your data.
All right, so we're gonna do a little card sorting activity here. I apologize that I don't have physical cards that you can move around and sort really well, but if you guys have a piece of paper, you're welcome to write things down. What I want you to do is work with your table as a group. I've got this page here with several different cards. Let's see, 24 different cards of recipe names. And this is actually something that applies to me pretty well because I have a recipe website and I've had to do something like this to figure out how in the world do I sort these so that people can find what they're looking for, especially knowing that I'm probably going to have more recipes coming in later that I don't know what they are. So talk amongst your tables for just a couple minutes and kind of figure out what categories would you put these in. Let's say a max of 5 categories that you would use to define the navigation for a website with these recipes on it. We're gonna come back together now. I wanna hear a table at a time. Let's say 1 for now, and then if you guys have something after everybody said something that you haven't heard, one of the structures that you can think of, then we'll go back. What about you guys? So, there's no wrong answers.
I don't know if we have something that we all unanimously love, but we kind of ended up having breakfast, lunch, dinner, and dessert.
Okay.
But we know that there's still some outliers that we would be able to categorize as cranberries.
Sure.
Like cranberries.
Okay. All right. So, like a time of day, what meal they go for. Okay. What about you guys?
We had came up with several ideas of ways to profile these. One was by dish style, appetizer versus sides, main courses, but also by
So like menu.
yeah, menu type. Yeah, or by ethnicity, you can do that, or by flavor profile. But I'm just thinking we're thinking different ways to.
Yeah. What about you guys?
Well, we talked about dessert and the variable healthiness, like salads and other things. So we did talk about like ethnicity groups, or I I feel like lunch and dinner is like the same kinds of food. So I was looking for like grouping by kind. Like we talked about like we could do breads, we could do pasta soups and salads, we could do peanuts.
Okay. And what about you guys?
So we just kept it to 5. We just did breakfast, sides, / starter. Throw soup in that. Dessert, drinks, or entree.
All right. Anybody have any other ideas that weren't said by any of the
We
groups?
also talked about sorting by like, dietary needs. So
Yeah.
like, these are like paleo, these are vegan or whatever,
Yeah,
and like things to be able to.
absolutely.
Other things were like ingredient based, like if it's seafood or vegetarian, which is sort of overlaps a little bit with like dietary. Or seasonality even, like holiday food versus summer food versus spring food.
Exactly. And there's, like I said, there's no right way to do this. When you're doing the user test after you've tested several different people, you start to see trends of like, what's the most common thing that they use? And then maybe use that as your main navigation. The cool thing about in Drupal is like when I was building my site, I actually went with kind of like a menu style. So we have like appetizers, main dishes, side dishes, desserts, and drinks, and sauces and, and icings and things like that. But the cool thing about it in Drupal is I can have that as my main navigation, and then I can use taxonomy terms to create all kinds of other tags. I have a celiac friend that needs to know how to find those gluten-free recipes real fast. I have other people that are vegan or vegetarian or have other allergies. And so you can use different taxonomy terms and tags to help clarify those so that you don't necessarily have to have categories on your front page about it, but you can still access those if you needed to, and they'd be searchable. So, any questions about card sorting and how that works? Cool. All right, so we're going to move on a little bit to some UX laws. These are all posted from lawsofux.com. I've got the link down there at the bottom. And these are some of the ones that are going to apply to building a menu. So Hick's law is the time it takes to make a decision increases with the number and complexity of choices. Let's boil that down a little bit. Basically, what it's saying is the more choices you have and the more complex choices those are, the harder it's going to be for the user to find what they're looking for. And so one of the things that falls into Hick's law is that if you're going to alphabetize things, it needs to be something where the user already knows the words that they're looking for. Doesn't work very well on a recipe website, for example, because the recipes could be named anything. And so you're not necessarily looking under dairy or something for a list and then knowing where to find it in alphabetical order. But for something that does do alphabetical order, whether it's a name or something else that you know what you're looking for exactly, how Hick's law works is the user looks at the top of the list and says, nope, that's not quite. And then they skip down and they say, oh, that's past it. And then they can just divide in half each time and find what they're looking for really fast rather than scrolling through an entire list and looking, you know, all the way A, B, C, D, E, etc. Oh, yeah.
I don't have a question. I have a statement. This is why I like Costco. They only have one ketchup. They only have one.
Find your choice.
There's a ketchup, exactly. Unfortunately, sometimes like some of their non-staple ingredients, they do change out over time, and don't get me started.
All the pages in your site.
Right, and we'll actually get to that later.
That's it. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. Don't hold back. And then there's Miller's Law. The average person can only keep 7 ± 2 items in their working memory. Meaning that like when you have navigation tiles or drop-down menus or even the main navigation menu itself, you usually want to keep it to 7. I say 7 or less because when you're getting to 9, you're kind of pushing it. Items, and that way it's not so many that like by the time they get to the end of the list, they've forgotten what was on the beginning. And so if they're looking for something and they're just trying to make sure that there's not a category that fits better what they're looking for, they can remember what the other categories were in that process. So mega menus, when they first came into the scene, are actually praised as being pretty good UX experiences. But the problem is you can do them wrong. And you can do just about anything wrong, let's be honest. But this is an example that Nielsen Norman gives of a good mega menu where you have higher level categories that break down into smaller categories. So you can find a higher level item subheader and search within that when that looks like it's a category that fits what you're looking for. The problem is when people create the mega menu, and this is what I call a UX crime, where I mean, like, some of these have like 10 or 11 items per list, and like gifts by recipient, you know, like a lot of these things are probably duplicated. One of the things the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on their style guide, one of the things that they have is that nothing will be duplicated under multiple categories in the menu. And so you'll have one place where that thing lives instead of having it living under 5 places, so you can catch anytime they find it. And the problem with having it in several different places in your main navigation is that eventually that just gets really crowded. And this is a problem that we had at BYU. I remember crying while applying to BYU because I got on there and literally the menu was so long, just link after link. And then what happens is stakeholders and other, you know, deans of departments and things like that, they all have sites that they feel are important, and everybody else has sites that they feel are important, and then there's the sites that their students need, and all of those get combined together and they just keep getting added on, and eventually you just have this huge conglomeration of links that nobody can navigate. And it's just not helpful at all because it's not categorized. So navigation guidelines. What Katria was just talking about, when you have various tiles that are on a landing page that point to your other sites, those are great. One of the problems that we had is we stripped out all drop-down menus at BYU and then moved back into having just a main navigation layer, and then those would take you to landing pages with tiles. But then everything became tiles. And I had some sites that I would run across that nothing, it was just a page full of tiles, like I was looking at Pinterest, but there were specific items I needed to look for. And so grid and masonry layouts are good for galleries and browsing. We're talking Instagram, Pinterest, things like that, where you're just like, just kind of casually swiping along and trying to look for something that interests you, inspires you, things like that. But if you're looking for something specific, it's really frustrating because there's no rhyme or reason to where it should be. So if you're going to do that, at least have some kind of category headers or something that'll help split it up. Menus and drop-downs should ideally have 7 links or less. We talked about that earlier. And then regardless of your navigation style, you can create a great or poor user experience. The key is moderation. Just try to keep it pared down to a good number of things, and then people will be able to find what they're looking for without getting lost. And sometimes that takes a lot more time at the beginning, but one of the beautiful things about user experience design is that generally you're cutting out a lot of technical debt and a lot of reworking by just getting it right the first time instead of having to send it back to development over and over again. This is called the Zeigarnik effect. I'm going to pretend like I said that right. People remember uncompleted or interrupted tasks better than completed tasks. So this is kind of twofold. One of the ways that this applies is that if you could use a progress bar, do so. That includes when you're loading a page. Generally, if the loading is going to take more than like 5 to 10 seconds, you usually want to have a progress bar instead of a spinning wheel, because sometimes people just assume if that spinning wheel goes on forever, your page is broken. And so with a progress bar, if you're doing a survey or an application, something like that, if they can see where they're at in it, they know, oh, there's still more to go, and they remember that they need to complete or make enough time for it. This also happens if you have parts of your site that are incomplete, that it gets cut off abruptly. That's more memorable than everything else that went right on your site, and they will just remember that part where it was broken. So keep that in mind when you're building. And then the aesthetic usability effect. Users often perceive aesthetically pleasing design as design that's more usable. So earlier we talked about how visual design needs to be the last step, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be a step at all. And so this is where I live. I'm the lead UI designer for BYU Office of IT. And so my job is essentially just making sure our branding and accessibility and everything looks nice on top of all of the research that we've compiled in the content organization. And so you can have 2 exactly the same functionality sites, and somebody will say that it's less usable if one of them is really ugly. Because sometimes that that visual design not only is just pleasing to look at, but also can establish the hierarchy that makes it easier to find things. So we're moving on to UI design. In UI design, you start out with various stages of prototyping. You can do some sketches, so paper prototypes, wireframes, which is, you'll see examples in just a moment, and then low fidelity and high fidelity prototypes. You don't always have to do every single one of these. Sketches, I feel, are the most useful when you're in a meeting with the stakeholders and the product owners, and you say, okay, is this what you're looking for? And you just draw it on the whiteboard or on a piece of paper really quick, and take a picture with your phone or something. And then you have that opportunity for them to go, oh no, that's not what I meant. And that will help weed that out way faster than if you go and develop that design on a computer, and then you bring it back to them and they say, oh, that's not what I meant, but you just wasted like a week. So these are a few examples. I'm very guilty of like skipping wireframe and lo-fi like almost completely. I jump to like what we call mid-fidelity, where it's not quite exactly like it needs to look like when it's done developing, but it's pretty close. And part of that is because BYU already has some branding already set up, so I know that there's some things that are not going to change in the high fidelity model, and so I can just plug them in and then make everything else match pretty well. Now the advantages to doing a low fidelity, however, is when you're doing things in grayscale and you're cutting out the pictures, you're not choosing fonts yet, it helps people look at the actual content of the page, because people, even those that aren't designers or developers, have a tendency to look at it and be like, oh, I'm not sure that I really care for that picture or that font, or maybe even that font size. And so at this stage, you're able to just kind of figure out your placement and your content, make sure that works. And then if they have a hard time finding things once you've developed it in high fidelity, if they struggle, that something was wrong with the colors that you chose or the font that you chose, or maybe even the images. And so it helps you weed out what the problems are by getting that out of the way initially and not letting them concentrate or over concentrate on all of these little nitpicky design things that maybe you haven't gotten to yet. I'm going to address really quick mobile first versus desktop. And part of the reason I want to say this is because I have a problem a lot lately with engineers that they hear about mobile first as like the new way to do things. And so they really push mobile first happening. And this is happening a lot right now, especially with our financial system, where people are filling out financial aid applications and other like really intense, complex forms, and they're wanting it to be mobile first. And all it really means is that you design how it looks on a phone and then build it out to how it would look on a desktop device. Instead of doing a responsive web design where you build it out how it would look on a computer and then pare it down to how it would look on a phone. So the web, it first came out like responsive got really big, and it's very important right now because we use all kinds of devices for everything. But then when mobile first came out, which is also referred to as content first design, because it makes you focus on what content needs to come first because you have such a limited space on the initial screen. So a lot of people are hyper focusing on that, and really like it's not applicable to all situations. So when you're doing desktop first or responsive design, some of the key elements that you need to have for that to be important is more than 80% of your traffic is on desktop, or 50% of your sales comes from desktop. For universities and other institutions where you don't necessarily have sales, there's usually other ways that you can track. For us, it's like how many calls do we have coming into our support center? Like, are they constantly getting inundated with people wanting password resets or something like that? If we can cut that number down, then that's increased revenue for us. Also, does it have supplemental support for core functions as a dedicated app on a phone? So for example, I'm trying to think of an exact one that we have at BYU, but sometimes like you just have a core function that doesn't work very well on a website, especially when it starts scaling down. So if you have an app that's especially dedicated to that service, then that's a good reason to still do a desktop first so that you have the app to supplement it. And then your product is intended for use on a desktop, such as a productivity tool or business-related service. This is where our financial system falls, where it's such a complex service that people are generally sitting at a computer when they do anyway, that putting it on a phone is way overkill and a ton of development hours and a lot of wasted money. Not that you shouldn't make it mobile first, or mobile first, but not that you shouldn't make it responsive to go down to a mobile, but sometimes it's appropriate to just put a banner at the top that says, hey, we see that you're on a phone. We have a better experience for you if you get on a computer. And just recommend that they move to another device. So mobile first, I feel like this statistic is more important than the desktop first, is that more than 80% of your traffic is on mobile or 50% of your sales coming from mobile. Because that's a lot less likely than like if you were to get 75% on desktop, does that mean that you moved to mobile? Absolutely not. It's still a lot more on the desktop side. And then the product type is entertainment, lifestyle, networking, news, or another on-the-go category. Something that somebody has a reason to pull out their phone and actually look it up rather than waiting until they get home and they're on a computer. And then the design is simple and minimalistic. One of the websites that I'm designing right now, the graphic designer has been putting a lot of graphics in it that are very text heavy, which I know that when you shrink it down on a phone, you won't be able to read a single line of that text. And so if the design is very simple, it will shrink down really well. You won't have to worry about trying to make it so that they can zoom in or whatnot. And the worst thing is side scrolling on a phone. Nobody needs to side scroll. It's a horrible user experience. So Jacob's Law, this is from Jacob Nielsen. Users spend most of their time on other sites. This means that users prefer your site to work the same way as all the other sites that they already know. Sometimes we like to think that our site is special, that people will just absolutely love it for the design that it has, for even the usability that we provided, but that usability is stunted if we try to be super outside of the box. Because unlike reading, where users are sitting down and they're trying to contemplate something, when they come on a website, they usually have a purpose and they want to search for it, get in, get out. And it's okay if they get in and get out if their job is complete. So some of the UI design trends that you want to follow to make sure that your site is matching what people are seeing elsewhere around you. And sometimes if you're just like, oh, I know that that's a weird place for something to be placed, then that's, a lot of times we say you're not the user, but sometimes there's things where you are the user and you understand from your own experiences that what's a bad and a good user experience. So the search goes in the upper right. If it's not there, that's always the first place that people look, and about 70% of the time people find it there really fast. And then if it's not there, they have to spend a lot of time searching for it. And that's usually not ideal. You usually have to search for your search. The logo placed in the upper left is always the fastest place that people find the brand. One of my professors was showing us a site for a design agency that they're pretty big. They're in like 5 different cities, and yet their name is nowhere on the site. They have a logo, and if it weren't for the URL address, I wouldn't have even known who they were. And so I was like searching everywhere, but first starting in that upper left, expecting it to be there. And then after that, maybe the center. But if it's anywhere else on the page, people don't really know where to look. Hamburger menus are for tablet and mobile only. This is changing somewhat, but this is one of the things that I want you guys to consider is that not everybody uses a phone or a computer as often as we do. And so there are some older users, there's other people that are just not technologically savvy, that they still don't recognize what a hamburger menu is. And so if you're hiding all of your navigation under a little button just to get a minimalistic design, you might be impeding tons of your users from even finding what they're looking for. And so I highly recommend that you use that on tablet and mobile where it's normal to find that and it's a smaller amount of space for them to be like, oh, what's that? And tap on it rather than having it hiding in the corner of a 1900 pixel screen.
On the left and halfway down the page, like underneath the visual, and I was like, and then every time I went to a page, I had to go back to that, open it up again, and then click the next page I wanted to see.
That's awful.
And I couldn't see the other pages to see what I wanted to look at, and I was like, be honest.
Yeah, if you get frustrated, if it takes you too long, one of the things they say in user experience is clicks are currency. If you're making a person click too far, go too far down the rabbit hole, it's just so much of a pain for them to get back to look for something. Maybe they went down that rabbit hole and didn't actually find what they expected to find. Now to come all the way back, they might just leave your site and go to somebody else. So especially if you're working for an agency or for a firm or anyone that you're building their site and they're competing with, they have competitors. At BYU, like once they're there, they're kind of stuck. Like we're like the DMV. Like you just gotta, you're gonna stick around. And so like the best thing we can do is just make it not painful. But on these other sites where you have competitors, you lose people by them feeling like it's just a pain to get around. Contact info or link, keep it in the footer, or sometimes they have it in the upper right corner, but just keep it in those places that are standard for people to look, because if they want to contact you because they have a question, they need to know where to find that information. I hate sites that I have to go down like 4 layers. I mean, even Amazon does this to some degree, and nobody's ever said that Amazon has the best user experience. But sometimes it's really, really hard to find out how to just chat with somebody to say, my stuff never came in and the seller's blowing me off, you know?
For the BYU homepage, they noticed in the statistics and the research that people were going to be on the site, or they just wouldn't go to the site, they'd go back to Google, search their thing because they couldn't find it in the big mega menu before it was redone. So that's like a kind of goes from the research side, they just want to use Google rather than your menu or your search. Maybe that means, okay, it is going down the rabbit hole to try to find the site.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and what we found out from a lot of our students is they don't even bother coming to the homepage to look for it in the first place. They just go to Google. Like a lot of our younger users, that's just how they function. So if you don't have really good SEO, it's really hard for them to find what they're looking for because they're expecting to be able to find the page that they want without having to start at the homepage and work their way in. So some UX crimes that I would like you guys to avoid. Moving things to unfamiliar locations. We talked about the search and some other things. That people know where they look for them on a standard website, and if they're not there on your website, they might think that they just don't exist at all. Unfamiliar icons. Don't reinvent the hamburger icon or the search icon. Apple gets a free pass for this because they have so many users on their site or on their phones already that they can kind of reinvent new UI trends because they have no choice but to follow along and get used to it. But most of us really just have to go with whatever the convention is. Stripping out descriptive text. And the time that this happens the most is in the search bar. It's really the best to actually have the word search either as a placeholder or, for example, if you do want to strip it down to just a magnifying glass, have the word search with it as well. Because especially people that aren't used to being on the web or those that are coming from another country or something, it might not be familiar for them that a magnifying glass describes that that's the search. And then learn more and other undescriptive links. We're going to get into that a little more later, but when screen readers are looking at your content, if they say, here's a button and it says learn more, and there's like 5 others that say learn more on the page, like they won't have a clue which one goes where. So we'll get back into that in a little bit. And then unfamiliar text descriptions. Don't say like reach out instead of contact us. If there's a standard term that's used for people to find something on your page, try to stick with whatever that term is so that whenever they're searching for it, they can find it faster. So accessibility. This is also known sometimes as A11Y, and that's because there's 11 letters between the A and the Y. So if you see that, it just means accessibility. That confused me so bad. I was like, what's ALI? And so that's really what it is. So accessibility is just essentially making the web, well, first of all, we have the ADA and they have accessibility responsibilities for people in wheelchairs and the blind and whatnot, but we also have a responsibility to web accessibility. And so that's supporting people that are blind, people that are colorblind, and then the ones that they don't think about a lot is mobility impaired, whether they just don't really have a good motor skills to be able to move a mouse around, maybe they have to use a keyboard, or even cognitively impaired. It takes them a while to think through things, and so you can't make things too complex or too overbearing. And this changes depending on where you are in the world. In China, it's not unusual to have a web page that is just completely full of content, like a news ad in a newspaper, like just content everywhere and flashing and being back in the 90s. But in the US, we're generally used to having a lot of white space, having things organized nicely so that we can find what we need as fast as possible. And if you are really slow thinking, it can be really frustrating to have things just jumbled everywhere. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, I just call it WCAG. I don't know if that's a normal thing, that's just how my head says it. But it's run by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C. They have a website here that you guys can go to on the slides that'll allow you to look at the standards and guidelines. It's very text heavy. You can find some things around the web on LinkedIn Learning or other places that give a good description of what accessibility is. But if you really need some hard details, that's where it's all going to be located. But basically boiling it down is you have A, AA, and AAA standards. So good, better, and great. At BYU, we are required to maintain AA standards as part of our university policy. And generally that will keep you from getting sued. So most accessibility laws require compliance with level A or AA. And when you're designing for accessibility, you need to make sure that the color contrast is such that if somebody's colorblind, that things aren't blending together because the colors are too close together, or that they vibrate against each other so hard that it just hurts to look at. Color cannot be your only indicator, especially if you're on a form. If the box lights up in red whenever you missed a field, that can't be the only indicator for having a missed field, because if you're colorblind, it looks like everything else. You need to have an icon or some text that says this field is required, or something else that indicates beyond the color. Even though color helps those of us that can see all colors find things faster, you need to have another way if they can't see that at all. Have readable font sizes in the body. That's generally on the web 14 to 17 pixels. Depending on the font that you're using, it might need to be different, but also you want to pick appropriate fonts for the web. And then responsive for multiple devices. If I'm on a phone, I'm not looking at a screenshot of the desktop site and having to scroll in and zoom in to find what I'm needing. So this is contrastchecker.com. I use this on an almost daily basis. And this is where you can come and check the color contrast on text that you're using on your page to find out if it's AA or AAA compliant. We shoot for AAA if we can get it, but AA is usually okay. And so what it's saying there at the bottom, so I've plugged in the background color, there's this royal blue, actually BYU's official royal blue, and then white text on top. And it's saying that it meets AA standards at both normal and 18-point fonts. And then it misses AAA standards except for when it's 18-point or higher. And so, and then the color difference, I'm going to be honest, I don't know exactly. There's a number scale that like meets the AAA guidelines, and I think that's what it is, but I don't exactly know what that number scale is, so I generally ignore it. Yeah, and so like at some point that contrast ratio is AAA compliant, but since I don't know exactly what breakpoints they are. Yeah. And so generally, especially for our branding, we try to make sure that we always have compliant colors so that whenever people are using our BYU branded colors on the web, that they're not pairing them with black or white and having them be unreadable. Accessibility personas. So we talked very lightly about personas earlier when you're identifying who your users are. When you're doing accessibility, you don't want to just be like, oh, they're just a disabled person. It's actually better to take one of your existing personas and then add a disability to that person. So we could say that this girl, Amanda, who's an interior designer, oh, this would be kind of hard if you're blind. But all of these traits that belong to Amanda, now let's say that she's blind on top of it. Now what does it look like when Amanda tries to access our site? So now you take this into development. This will apply a little bit more to Drupal, but hopefully if you guys are also designing the pages that you develop, that kind of gives you some background and some methods to use. This is the Doherty threshold, another UX law. Productivity soars when a computer and its users interact at a pace of less than 400 milliseconds. It ensures that neither has to wait on the other. So as long as it's less than that, generally people don't notice the wait and the lag and feel like your site is still stuck in dial-up. So generally, there are plenty of sites out there that you can check the speed of your web pages. I highly recommend going and checking them out. Google has a few. So accessibility and development. This is actually where accessibility matters the most, even though the contrast checker and stuff is really important, and that's actually what I deal with on a daily basis. This is the part that gets ignored and actually makes it hardest for especially blind users to read. So by raise of hands, who's heard of this in the news recently? I mean, this happened like within the last couple weeks. So basically what happened, and you can tell when you read these articles that the journalists writing their articles don't have a clue what web development does, because they'll usually be like, oh, they didn't have accessibility software or something. I was like, nobody needs accessibility software to make sure that their site is compliant. What happened was this blind man tried to get on Domino's website to get an online only coupon, and there was no alt text on the images. So for those of you that may be unfamiliar, alt text is essentially the text that shows up whenever an image doesn't. And so if the image doesn't load, it'll just say, this is a description of what was in the picture. But if a person's using a screen reader because they can't see it at all, that's what the screen reader reads to them. And so this man had no alt text to define where he needed to go on the site and couldn't get around, and ended up suing Domino's and winning. It went to the Supreme Court. And accessibility is still kind of making its way now. The ADA has compliance regulations for universities. We have to be really careful. There's like some old lady out there that isn't disabled in any way, doesn't know anybody that's disabled as far as we know, but she goes out and her little personal vendetta is finding people that are violating accessibility and like just suing them. And so we need to be really careful about making sure that we are making our sites as accessible as possible so that we don't end up in Domino's shoes, where I imagine they probably turned around to their developers and said, what the heck? Because at least for me, ever since I started using or learning HTML, alt text has always been something that's been highly encouraged. Maybe not stressed as hard as it is now, but if you're leaving the alt text off of your images, that's more laziness than ignorance.
Are there any guidance around what should be filled in for alt text? Because often it's required, but people might just write image. Right?
Yeah,
It's like, you know, no
writing
value
image
or something.
absolutely is probably about as bad as just not
Exactly.
plugging it in at
And
all.
so I wonder how that happens, because it's required fill often. But is there any guidance around like what should be filled in?
So that photo, I would just say Domino's store or something like that. It doesn't have to be super descriptive. Usually it's like girl holding her phone or looking at her phone or something to that degree. But the last thing you want to do is leave it blank. Now, the nice thing with Drupal is whenever I give people access to adding content to my site, is I specifically make it so that they can't skip the alt text. It is required. They add an image, they can't save without putting the alt text in. And sometimes I miss the alt text myself, and so when I go to save, I'm like, oh yeah. And sometimes I'm literally just saying, that's a picture of Rebecca Bean.
That's also why you want to have like people not in terms of like overlaying images, because you can't put all of like technically that's the guidelines say if all the text that is inside the image you should put in the alt text. Like it needs to be available outside of the image. So you either put a summary underneath or those.
All right, I just was notified that I am out of time. But really quick, you guys can look at this later. This is just going a quick overview of what you need to make sure you include in your HTML. Alt text is the absolute bare minimum. Captions on videos, doing sections and ARIA labels to help screen readers jump around. Descriptive links, don't use learn more when you can say, go here to look at this particular page. And screen reader optimization. There's a link where you can learn more about it. There's an example of HTML sections. Screen readers, there's keyboard accessible grids that just help them say, okay, out of these 9 grids, I want to go in grid 1, and then it breaks that into 9 grids, and you can keep going down until you can get to what you need to click on. And then the read aloud. Here's a sample of at Slick. They have a screen reader demo, and you can hear how fast they talk, kind of like I am right now, where you can kind of get a feel for how disorienting it would be if it jumped all over the page. This, I didn't expect you to be able to read, but I hope if you go later, you can actually see the different levels of certain items that you can include in your website. And then validation is literally after you've finished building it out in stage or dev, you go and test it with some users to make sure it works as intended before you launch. So if you have any questions, there's my email. I'm also on the Drupal Utah Slack at Arbeen, so go contact me there if you want to know any more. Thanks.